Hi, this is Erin Perkins for EDL 853, my case study on Get This Child Out of My Room. As a brief overview, we have Susan, who's a first-year special education teacher working for a cooperative in a very rural district. She's taken over the place for someone who has lots of experience, who's been well supported in her school. And then she's inherited on her caseload a student named Carl, who is going through some extreme behavior changes, probably due to the fact that his parents have just had a very bitter divorce. And it's had a great impact on his education. He's gone from some self-harming behaviors to now aggressive behaviors, mainly towards his student, Mrs. Taylor. Mrs. Taylor has been observing these things on a daily basis, taking in lots of aggression from Carl. She's at her wit's end. She's coming to Susan to demand that Carl be removed from her room. Susan's trying to gather more information, trying to be really as diplomatic as possible in the best practices for keeping a child in a general education classroom, and is running into some opposition from Mrs. Taylor, who just really is seeking to have him out of her room. So following the advice from a district special education coordinator, Susan writes a behavior intervention plan on her own to remove Carl to the resource room when a behavior occurs that becomes too aggressive for the classroom. And then she holds a new IEP meeting to go through this plan with the parents. At that meeting, it becomes pretty obvious that the parents are still having some difficulties with each other, and really showing exactly why Carl's struggling the way he is at school. In this scenario, I think it's best to focus on the three key players: Carl, Mrs. Taylor, and Susan. Carl's behaviors, like we've stated, have changed from self-harming to physical aggression towards his teacher, and his plan, we know, is no longer effective. What we need to know is what's really causing these behaviors, what motivates him in school to maybe help these behaviors decrease, and help put in a more effective plan for him. We know that Mrs. Taylor is just desperate to get him out of his room, mainly because she's the one who's under constant attack. Carl's behaviors are so far just directed at his teacher, not towards anyone else. So what we need to know is what interventions has she tried? Have any been suggested to her? What has she come up with doing on her own? What is she comfortable with doing in her own classroom? And what is she going to ultimately be asked to do to step up and get some other additional things done for Carl, keeping him in his least restrictive environment? We know that Susan is a new teacher who has just written a new IEP and a new plan with really little support all on her own. She's trying to take in the experience of teachers' concerns while also following procedures and adhering to special ed law in terms of least restrictive environment. Also dealing with the fact that she works for a cooperative that's so spread out that really support isn't readily available for things that she may need. And her internal support is also limited too. What we need to know is, are there any other programs or teachers or avenues that she can pursue to get ideas from for interventions for this behavior intervention plan? Is there anyone else who can come in and observe and be another set of eyes? What other resources are really at her disposal? So, problem we see right here is with no full-time administrator, not really accounting the assistant who's also full-time teaching on a daily basis. There doesn't really seem to be anyone that can unite the parties to wrap around Carl and form a solid plan for him. There's a big lack of communication going on and collaboration. So if I am this administrator, the assistant, so to speak, who this is now a case that's going to be on my radar that's going to require some extra time. Susan is doing her best to reach out to the limited resources she has at her disposal, or resources that necessarily aren't quite so readily at her fingertips. As a first-year teacher, she's finding it difficult to gain partnership from the experienced Mrs. Taylor to maybe try new things before needing to jump straight into changing Carl's programming. I believe that there are steps that can and should be taken before this new plan was written and put into place. Now it's here. Let's figure out what we can do now. What interventions can we put into place? I believe we do need to do a functional behavior assessment, and then make modifications to his behavior intervention plan. Use the pull-out resource room time as it's deemed necessary. So my plan of action is to open up that communication between the teachers and the administrators so everyone is on board. and with the parents as well. Even though they're both very distinct with this divorce going on, everyone needs to be on the same page with Carl and supporting what's going to work best for him in the classroom. To carry out the current behavior intervention plan and identify interventions that can be used. And in doing so, we also need to make sure that Carl knows what his plans look like. What happens when he's asked to leave a room? How does he do it safely? How does he know where he's going? Does he have a relationship built up with Susan, whose room he's going down into? Who does he have a relationship with that can help get him there? So that removing him when a behavior occurs isn't a constant problem, or that restraints have to be used. That's not in the kid's best interest. That's something that the law is trying to get away from anyway. So also then in this plan of action is conducting a functional behavior assessment. In these weekly meetings, I would advise Susan to get in touch with behavior specialists within the co-op for strategies to try both in the classroom before behavior occurs, so preventative strategies, and in the resource room, so for calm down time, reflection on his behaviors, what motivators does he, will help him increase his appropriate behavior. Both teachers should probably also have a shared document to take data on what they're seeing and how interventions are working. This can be their more informal form of communication and a daily check-in on Carl's progress. As while we're trying to minimize these aggressive behaviors, it's going to be important that they take some good solid data and take care of what they need. Also, based on the functional behavior assessment and interventions, another IEP may be necessary, potentially adding social work or counselor support based on what the findings of this functional behavior assessment are. I think then, through this plan of action, for our 3 key players, we'll see some specific gains. Carl will still be able to access his least restrictive environment as much as possible, so having the same general education curriculum and instruction, hopefully with interventions being put in place for preventative measures, he will be able to be in there more and not have to be pulled out quite so much. But even when he is pulled out, he can work through the struggles that he's having to gain a better reflection of himself, which is also important in him being a successful student. Mrs. Taylor will gain strategies for both Carl and for any other kids that would come into his classroom. She needs to have her needs met by getting relief from the negative behaviors, and his classroom needs to see that there is something that's happening because he has gotten so aggressive. However, he needs to see that he's learning something new. He's trying to work through his difficulties. Mrs. Taylor is also needing to gain some new things by working with a new teacher and how she may do things differently. Susan then hopefully will gain some connections with her colleagues, which is going to make her a better teacher all around. Hopefully with all these different tools that she's filling her toolkit with, being able to have some support from the general education teacher. So overall, with these points that I would like to put in place, hopefully all 3 of these key players will see some significant gains. As I kind of went through this problem, my thought processes were definitely aligned with Susan. It's going to be in my nature as being a special education teacher, especially with the students with behaviors. So I immediately sided with Susan and what she was trying to do to make her situation work. I really found it hard to believe that there wasn't a clearly defined, well, not hard to believe, but I would find it hard to work in an area where there isn't a clearly defined leader every day whose role is solely an administrator, so that you have someone to turn to readily and not having to worry about interrupting a classroom in order to get some support. Even when I worked for a special education cooperative where resources are more spread out, I felt like I had readily access to them more so than Susan does. Again, siding with her, but I would personally struggle to work in an area where there's not an ever-present leader. I also found it hard to believe that the advice that she got and everyone's attitude was more and more of remove and then rewrite right away, not try some interventions first before you have to get more paperwork involved. I guess my best practice has always been to try interventions and what can we do before we need to make these drastic changes. I mean, always have that communication going on with parents or with the other teachers of let's try this, and if it's something that's formal enough that needs to be written into, put down into writing for an IEP because we've seen that it's worked, then great. And we've also tried something that isn't necessarily working, we can, scrap that plan, move on to something else. But I would think that there's a system should be a system in place of let's try some interventions before we completely change an entire plan. Some of the unresolved issues I see then that I would want to address over time to help curb any of these future problems from happening. Things that I didn't put in my plan of action, but things that should happen sometime in the near future. I mean, can the district look at reframing their administrative support levels? That's a bigger issue that I don't know whether to push for or not. Collaboration for least restrictive environment and maybe potential some staff training. What does the school as a whole know and can help do to keep a child in their class? And then a mentor for Susan. I mean, who does she have to go to on a daily basis to talk through some of these issues with, who can give her some more life experience and hands-on, really quick, right-away tips? So, in this action plan, I see that it has promoted the academic success for every student through collaboration. More teachers working together opens up more opportunities for more students. Interventions aren't just going to be used for Carl. They're going to be tools that can be used for other students as well. And then general education services teaches the students in the classroom to be understanding and tolerant when another student may struggle, but and to see those as different learning capabilities that other people may have. But also, again, having to remove a student when behaviors comes to extreme does show that they're all kids' safety and support is valued. How does this plan promote the well-being of every student? Well, implementing the behavior intervention plan, teaching Carl how to work through his emotions when his behavior becomes so aggressive. Removing him keeps the student safe. Teaching him with the functional behavior assessment as to why his behaviors are the way they are, hopefully prevents things from escalating. And then teaching him also the de-escalation strategies works with his emotional health, his overall well-being. This divorce and this changes in his family aren't things that are going to go away anytime soon. How is he going to be able to cope with it long term? And those de-escalation strategies or interventions that can be used when he's in the resource room would be beneficial to that. How does this plan enhance instructional capacity? Well, connecting with other specialists helps Susan gain more skills, builds her own capacity for instruction and working with students. Putting general education interventions in place, starting with just Mrs. Taylor and Susan in that classroom, will benefit Carl in the classroom, and then the students that are in his classroom as well, seeing things that can be done for a student who is struggling. And then the need for staff development with the collaboration and general education interventions training beyond the two teachers that involved. Maybe they can take and present to other people. This is how we were able to do things that we were able to put in place for this child. These are some ways that you can use it in your room if you were ever to see certain behaviors occurring as well. So that's kind of my assessment, my wrap-up of this case study. Thank you very much.